Before perfume, before plumbing, before anyone knew what a bathroom was, Queen stank. We're not talking a bit of musk or the elegant sweat of a royal waltz. We're talking blackened teeth, lice-infested wigs, menstrual rags soaked in blood, and reused for months, and so much perfume you could choke a horse. The royal court may have sparkled with gold, jewels, and lace, but beneath those shimmering gowns, rot, infection, filth. Forget everything you've imagined about courtly grace. Because behind every powdered face was a mouth full of rot. Behind every silk corset, a body coated in weeks-old sweat. Some of the most powerful women in history, rulers of empires, went weeks without washing, months without changing clothes, and years without cleaning what mattered most. Their perfume was not luxury, it was defense. Their elegance was not hygiene, it was camouflage. And if you think you could survive one day as a queen in the medieval or Renaissance courts, think again. These are the stories your textbooks never told. Of queens who rule with an iron fist, while stinking of death, of beauty built on decay, of bodies that decompose while still alive. Light a candle, hold your breath, and prepare for the real scent of history. She was a Catholic queen who changed the world. She unified Spain, expelled entire empires, and launched the Age of Exploration. But beneath the crown, Queen Isabella of Castile reeked. She wasn't just holy, she was fermented in faith. During Spain's brutal Reconquista, the centuries-long war to drive Muslim rulers from the Iberian Peninsula, Isabella made a vow before her army and her God. I will not change my linen until the city of Granada falls. Not her robes, not her undergarments, not for battle, not for ceremony, not even for disease. This wasn't a one-week skirmish. It lasted nearly 10 years. Let's put that into perspective. 10 years without changing her underwear. According to historical records and centuries of whispered legend, Queen Isabella took only 2 baths in her entire life. The first was when she was born. The second, the night before her wedding. Most likely, against her will. After that, she believed bathing was not just unnecessary, it was dangerous. Water was said to open the pores and allow sickness to invade the body. And to Isabella, dirt became divine. During the siege of Granada, her vow turned her into a walking icon of sacrifice, a holy woman wrapped in sweat, a monarch whose body told the story of war. The tents of her military camp were said to reek so badly that soldiers avoided the queen's pavilion altogether. Physicians begged her to change clothes. Priests worried her suffering was too extreme. Her linen undergarments, what few survived, were said to have yellowed, stiffened, and literally rotted against her skin. The smell? Described as the rot of piety. Even her horses were said to shy away from her scent. Attendants drew lots to determine who would stand near her. Granada fell in 1492. A city, a kingdom, an empire, all collapsed under the weight of her religious fire. And what did Isabella do with her vow? She burned the garments she'd worn during the siege. Not washed, burned. Some chroniclers claim the linens were considered holy relics at first, evidence of her devotion and purity, until someone realized that the stench might kill people faster than the war ever did. They say no plague touched her body, that her odor alone drove off illness, that God protected her because she embraced the filth of her cause. Others say she was lucky to survive her own bacteria. Either way, she ruled Spain like a burning sword, glorious, untouchable, and encased in rot. When Christopher Columbus first met her, she wore a robe made of wool and sweat, layered with perfume thick enough to burn the lungs. He sailed west of the New World. But she stayed behind, marinating in martyrdom. Her reign was legendary. Her hygiene, a war crime. She was the most glamorous woman in Europe. She dripped in diamonds. She hosted midnight balls that cost more than most wars. She changed fashion with a glance and shattered empires with a smile. But if you step behind the golden curtains of Versailles, past the silks, past the powdered wigs, you find a queen whose beauty was built on rot. Marie Antoinette stank. Not because she wanted to, because royal hygiene in 18th century France wasn't about cleanliness. It was about illusion and survival. Marie did bathe occasionally, But it wasn't a private ritual of relaxation. It was a public performance. Her copper tub sat in the middle of a room, surrounded by dozens of onlookers, ladies-in-waiting, physicians, servants, nobles, all standing quietly as she stripped bare. The queen was never allowed to be alone, not even while naked. Even the order in which garments were removed was regulated by rank. Baths were filled with warm water scented with orange blossom, herbs, and rose oil, meant more to cover smell than to cleanse. And these baths, they were rare. Weeks passed between them, sometimes months. Most days, Marie used cloths soaked in vinegar or alcohol to rub her body down. No soap, no scrubbing, just a royal dab and splash, then back into layers of silk and whalebone corsets. Her menstruation was tracked by everyone, from servants to diplomats. The entire court kept records of her cycle, desperate for a royal heir. And when she bled, there were no pads, no tampons, just rags. Rough linen cloths folded and tucked between her legs. These were washed, barely, and reused, often still stained, still damp. She wore them inside tight gowns, beneath embroidered petticoats and metal corsets, bleeding, sweating, in silence. The smell? Her crown was infested. Her hair was a castle of filth. Towering wigs, sculpted into ships, gardens, even castles, were cemented in place with animal fat, lard, and powder. Once styled, they weren't touched again for weeks. Lice moved in. Rats, yes, rats, were known to crawl into the hair of sleeping noble women. It became common to sleep with silver cages around your head to keep vermin out. Marie's hairpieces often had to be disinfected with vinegar smoke before reuse. But perfume covered everything, or tried to. She wore so much ambergris, jasmine, and musk that entering a room after her was like being hit with a scented brick. Versailles was beautiful, and it reeked. No running water, no toilets. Nobles relieved themselves in stairwells, fireplaces, hallways. Chamber pots overflowed, rotting food piled behind curtains. Human waste seeped into the marble floors. The palace stank of urine, feces, perfume, rot, and roses. Marie's gowns, stitched from delicate silk and brocade, couldn't be washed. They'd fall apart. So she just changed clothes. Constantly, dozens of times a day. Not because they were clean, but because they looked clean. Marie Antoinette's downfall wasn't just political. It was sensory. The people of France, starving and filthy, watched her bathe in perfume and powdered lies. They mocked her for her wigs, her gowns, her lace, never knowing that underneath it all, she was rotting too. She didn't have the luxury of hygiene. She had the burden of performance. Behind her powdered smile, her gums bled. Behind her lace veil, her scalp oozed. Behind her gowns, her body festered. And when the revolution came for her, they didn't just strip her of her crown. They stripped her of perfume, of powder, of privacy. They let the world see the queen as she truly was. Not a goddess, not a monster, just a woman in pain. A woman who stank. A woman who bled. She ruled an empire that spanned oceans. She faced down assassin, usurpers, and Spanish warships. She wore the crown of a golden age and never married a soul. But Queen Elizabeth I hid a secret, a very smelly one. She was a virgin queen, but beneath her glowing portraits and legendary speeches, she lived in a world of filth, fear, and silent rot. The truth? She was decomposing in real time. In Elizabeth's court, water wasn't cleansing. It was terrifying. Doctors warned that bathing opened your pores to bad air, letting disease crawl inside your skin. And Elizabeth listened. She bathed once a month. Maybe even that was considered extreme. When she did bathe, it was a grand ritual. A massive copper tub was dragged into her private chamber. Servants boiled water over fires and poured it in carefully, mixing it with herbs, flower oils, and vinegar. The queen would then sit like a statue, wrapped in perfumed steam, while her ladies gently dabbed her skin with linen cloths. There was no soap, no scrubbing, no privacy. It wasn't cleansing. It was cosmic theater. Elizabeth believed the skin stayed clean if the linens were clean. So she changed her undergarments often, sometimes daily, to courtiers, That made her look obsessive. To modern standards, it's horrifying because she didn't wash her body. She washed around it. Her sweat was soaked up by linen shifts. Her odor masked with rose water and ambergris. Her hands wiped down with vinegar cloths. But her body? It festered beneath gowns, corsets, and metal stays, trapped in a cocoon of fabric and denial. Her legendary beauty was quite literally poison. Elizabeth wore a thick white foundation known as Venetian ceruse, a paste made from white lead and vinegar. It covered scars from smallpox. It also killed skin cells, caused lesions, and slowly poisoned her bloodstream. To maintain the illusion, she reapplied it daily, layer upon layer, and when it cracked, she sealed the gaps with beeswax, animal fat, and more powder. By the end of her life, her skin was covered in sores, ulcers, and pustules, hidden beneath a mask that glittered in candlelight. Elizabeth's diet was sugar-heavy and acidic. By middle age, her gums had receded, her teeth were black, and her breath was described as fetid. She rarely brushed. Instead, she chewed spices, cloves, or rinsed her mouth with wine and honey. But nothing could hide the decay. Diplomats avoided standing too close. Even her own courtiers whispered of the stench. Yet to question it was treason. To turn away was death. So they inhaled and smiled. Her period was her most closely guarded secret. But it wasn't private. There were no tampons, no pads, and no privacy. Elizabeth used thick linen clouts, rags folded into her underclothes, often held in place with a special girdle. These were washed, reused, sometimes stained. She bled into layers of linen beneath tight gowns and steel corsets. With no running water, there was little relief. And yet, she sat on her throne, commanded armies, dictated law, while bleeding, and no one dared speak of the smell. As she aged, Elizabeth refused to be seen without her face paint. She banned mirrors from her palace. She ate alone. She became a living ghost, hidden behind paint, lace, and perfume. When she died in 1603, her body was so fragile, so painted, that her ladies were afraid to wash her. They perfumed her corpse instead, and as her body lay in state, the people mourned the end of an era, but the stench of the virgin queen lingered. She ruled for 45 years. She never married. She outlived her enemies. But beneath the crown, she was rotting from within. She was feared. She was powerful. She ruled France from behind the throne, with a smile as sweet as syrup, and a soul darker than ink. But there was one thing Catherine de' Medici feared more than betrayal, more than death, more than hell itself: bathing. The Queen Mother of France, the same woman who orchestrated political marriages, crushed religious uprisings, and allegedly ordered assassinations, was terrified of water. And so, like many royals of her time, she embraced a new weapon, not the sword, not poison, but perfume. Catherine de' Medici believed that water opened the pores and allowed disease to seep in. Bathing, in her view, didn't cleanse. It invited death. So she didn't scrub. She didn't soak. She didn't cleanse. Instead, she camouflaged. She drenched her body in fragrance: rose water, ambergris, civet, jasmine, and the oily musk of deer glands. She had entire chambers in her palaces dedicated to perfume. She carried scented sachets sewn into her corsets. Even her bed curtains were steeped in oils. Her entire world reeked of sweetness, because underneath it, she stank. Catherine didn't just use perfume. She weaponized it. She popularized a deadly trend across Europe: perfumed gloves. These weren't the dainty accessories worn at tea. These were leather gloves soaked in oils and sometimes poisons. It's rumored that Catherine gave a pair of perfumed gloves to a rival noblewoman who died shortly after. Historians argue about the truth, but the fear was real. From that day on, everyone smelled their gloves before wearing them. She wore layers: heavy gowns, metal bone corsets, lined underskirts, chokers, and lace sleeves. Despite the heat, the dust, and the lack of bathing, her clothes were rarely washed. They were sprayed with perfume, dusted with powder, and hung to dry. Underneath, skin that hadn't been cleaned in weeks, sweat trapped in ruffles, body odor sealed beneath satin. And her wigs? coated in powder animal fat and powdered lice killer, a mix that caked her scalp in grime and toxins. Catherine's court became a place of elegance and putrefaction. The air was thick with rose oil, but also with sewage, blood, and decay. People collapsed from heat and scented balls. Doctors warned of perfume fevers. Servants wore cloths over their faces to withstand the fumes. But Catherine kept spraying, kept dousing, kept layering scent upon scent, until even death smelled sweet. Her body was perfumed before burial. Not cleaned, not bathed, just steeped in flowers, then wrapped in silk. The noble women of France followed her example for decades, turning perfume into armor, into shield, into cure. But the truth remained. Catherine de' Medici ruled not with soap and water, but with rot, roses, and fear. You thought the stench stopped at Elizabeth and Marie? Oh no. History is bloated with queens who ruled while rotting, who looked divine but smelled hellish. Let's open a few more velvet curtains, shall we? And of Austria. Queen of France, mother to Louis XIV, was a portrait of power, but behind her jeweled mask, she bled in silence. Anne's court had no concept of menstrual hygiene beyond rags and vinegar. She suffered chronic infections and was known to bleed through her gowns in public. She couldn't wash often. Doctors feared warm water would weaken the womb. Instead, she was advised to bind herself with cold cloths, which were reused until they reeked. When she miscarried, servants were ordered to burn the linens, not for ceremony, for biohazard control. She once attended court 3 days after miscarriage, sewn into a corset stained with her own blood. Perfume didn't just mask pain, it held her together. Imagine a royal so powerful she built a palace out of ice and filled it with excrement. Tsarina Anna Ivanovna, niece of Peter the Great, ruled Russia in the 18th century with sadistic sense of humor and zero concern for hygiene. Her court was a cesspool of filth, where nobles relieved themselves in hallways and vodka replaced water. Why? Because bathing was French, and Anna hated the French. She once forced a noble couple to live in a frozen ice palace as punishment. There were no baths, just a chamber pot carved from frozen sewage. She believed that suffering purged sin. Her linens were changed rarely, her hair powdered, but never washed. Even foreign ambassadors wrote that the Tsarina's court reeked like a battlefield after rain. Her solution? Burn incense in fireplaces, douse herself in pine tar perfume, and ban discussions of odor under penalty of exile. Anna didn't care if her court rotted. She cared if it looked obedient. Catherine, too, known as Catherine the Great, modernized Russia. She reformed education, led military victories, and ruled an empire for 34 years. But personal hygiene? Not her empire. Like most royals of the time, Catherine feared bathing. She preferred dry cloths, rose water wipes, and daily changes of linen shirts over any actual washing. Her skin was powdered. Her breath? A cocktail of tooth rot and opium. Why? Because she suffered from chronic abscesses and gum infections, partly from mercury pills prescribed as medicine. Despite her enormous palace, her chamber pot sat beside her throne, hidden behind curtains. When full, servants were expected to remove it in silence. Her lovers were required to douse themselves in perfume before entering her bedchamber. She didn't allow mirrors near her bed. No one was allowed to speak of the smell, not even the emperor. In all these cases, queens weren't lazy. They were terrified that bathing would kill them, terrified that water brought disease, not relief, terrified that washing would weaken the body or unleash sin. So they layered on powder, paint, and perfume until they were embalmed in life. They sat on gold thrones while their bodies decomposed beneath the lace. And when death came, most were buried without bathing, wrapped in scented linens, sealed in cedar, masked with flowers. Because if they smelled like roses, perhaps no one would remember the rot. They wore crowns. They held empires in the palms of their perfumed hands. They gave orders that shook continents, yet they couldn't clean their own bodies. We imagine queens as flawless. Porcelain skin, pearl-draped elegance, power without pain. But the truth? Royalty stank. And the women who ruled history's greatest courts often did so while bleeding, rotting, and suffocating under layers of disease and denial. Queen Isabella of Castile, who unified Spain and funded Columbus, wore the same undergarments for nearly a decade. She bathed twice, once at birth, once before her wedding. Marie Antoinette, icon of excess, had lice in her hair, menstrual rags in her corset, and perfume gowns that never saw water. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, was a living statue of lead and vinegar, her teeth blackened, her skin dying beneath white paint, and her womb wrapped in cloth soaked in blood. Catherine de' Medici turned fear into fashion, building a perfume empire to cover the fact that her court hadn't scrubbed in weeks. And Catherine the Great, ruler of the Enlightenment, carried chamber pots to her own throne while suffering from oral infections and untreated rot. These queens weren't careless. They weren't unclean by choice. They were prisoners of their era, of beliefs that claimed water was deadly, of patriarchal court rituals that saw their pain as divine and their bleeding as shameful yet public. They were taught that a clean shirt made a clean soul, that perfume could mask death itself. And so they endured, silently, secretly, stinking in silk. Their bodies weren't temples. They were battlefields where religion, superstition, and royal etiquette collided. And somehow, in the middle of all that, these women still ruled, still made history. They signed treaties while suffering from chronic infections. They held court while bleeding through corsets. They stood at coronations with lice in their wigs and rot beneath their fingernails. These queens, they didn't just wear crowns. They carried civilizations on their backs while hiding disease beneath diamonds. Ask yourself, could you endure a single day wearing a 40-pound dress with no underwear change, no toilet, and lice crawling in your hair? Could you lead an empire with a toothache so severe it made you faint, while everyone around you bathed in rosewater lies? Could you bleed in silence every month, while the court took notes on your cycle like a political stock ticker? Could you be royal while rotting? So the next time you walk into a room of flowers and perfume, remember, it might be hiding something. Behind every powdered portrait in a museum, behind every golden statue, behind every elegant oil painting, there was a woman, a body, a smell, a secret. She wasn't just a queen. She was human, and she reeked.